it's very easy for me to speak about George Padmore. It's a biographical character. He's a fascinating character. But I actually just came today from another Black History Month event here at Queen Mary that was more of a conversation, and that was having a discussion about, where is Black history now? What is Black History Month? And I'm grateful to Robbie actually for steering me to not talk about Padmore and to talk about this project and this work, because it's easy for Black History Month to become a month that is, some of the students today that I was listening to are expressing frustration at that kind of tokenism that Black History Month can become, and just kind of celebrating a few individual heroes. And one of my goals in the research that I'm going to share with you now was multiple, one of which, and the first and foremost was to be able to, affirm the breadth of intellectual history and discussion that was going on in this particular moment in the 1930s, beyond just an individual or two, and also beyond what has been documented and what I was involved in documenting in London and in Britain and in Europe. But to also ask what putting Britain's colonies and Britain itself into dialogue can tell us about the 1930s, about anti-colonialism and anti-fascism. So when I started this project, those were my kind of background goals in what I was thinking about. And so I'm happy to have a conversation about how that fits into the goals about how we do Black history, and how we think about this history more broadly. So I'm going to start the story that I'm going to tell you with the man that's on your screen. This is ITA Wallace Johnson, Isaac Theophilus Wallace Johnson, who was born in Sierra Leone. And the story I want to begin with is this. On the 3rd of September, 1939, so a few days into the Britain's declaration of war, the Sierra Leone police force raid Isaac Theophilus Wallace Johnson's office. They find him at his desk, and the article that's snatched from his typewriter, which is unfinished at the time, and which is contained in the report that is made of this raid, is called Fascism, Its Construction, Methods, and Practice and Activities, sorry. In this article, Wallace Johnson compares policy in the British colonies with fascist practices. And what he does when he does this is actually build on an argument that he had already made in London in 1937 at a rally in Trafalgar Square, in which he declared that, quote, colonial powers had turned the African continent into one large concentration camp. Now, one Colonial Office official in the report said Wallace Johnson's journalism was, quote, of course, very absurd. The article in the typewriter was not, in fact, the reason for the raid in which he was arrested and incarcerated. Wallace Johnson was well known for having spent time in Moscow in the early 1930s. He had already been convicted for criminal libel in the Gold Coast in a case that attracted the attention of British civil liberties organizations, including the NCCL, the National Council for Civil Liberties. The governor in Sierra Leone had been trying to deport Wallace Johnson for several years. The governor passed 6 different bills in the process of trying to deport Wallace Johnson. But the war, it was the war that gave them the new measures that they needed to arrest Wallace Johnson and detain him in various facilities until the spring of 1944. So he's arrested very much on the culmination of the war, and he's moved to various facilities, but detained until 1944 as a threat to the war effort, essentially. Now, as I've already alluded, Wallace Johnson's case is very well known. I had known of his work with the International African Service Bureau in London, where he worked with George Padmore, Jomo Kenyatta, and many others. He had spent time in Moscow. He was known to Black British historians, and he's known very much to West African printing histories, particularly because of his charge of sedition in the Gold Coast in 1936. So it's easy to tell this story as kind of one more notch in the histories of interwar internationalism, of anti-colonial nationalism, or of colonial anxiety over communism, pre-official Cold War. However, what I want to suggest and what I argue in today is that to follow the lead of the colonial official who dismissed his journalism as absurd is to follow a long-standing scholarly elision that sees critiques of fascism in colonial territories as either kind of preordained by fascism's racism, as derivations of debates that were happening in Europe, or purely as kind of pragmatic accusations to critique colonial rule. Meanwhile, histories that include arguments about fascism from the perspective of colonized people leave the impression that these debates typically occurred in metropolitan spaces, in Britain, in France, and didn't necessarily happen in the colonies themselves. And so, as I've already said, that was what I was trying to work from, is to show that this debate was much more widespread than people had suggested in the past. And what I argue is that the colonies of the British Caribbean and West Africa tell a different story from this historiography that sees fascism as debates about fascism as derivative of what's happening in Europe. Rather, what I want to show today is that colonized workers and educated elites from a wide spectrum of society approached fascism as a set of political ideas and practices that were to be wrestled with in their own intellectual contexts. And where I get this from, Robbie, you can flip the slide, is an archive of 14 daily or weekly newspapers that I've looked at from Trinidad, Jamaica, Ghana, and Nigeria. Now, these newspapers, I argue, demonstrate that readers and writers in each of these British colonies identified the classic features of fascism and debated it in a relational process in terms of how fascism related to colonialism and their own experience of colonialism. Now, to give you an idea of the sources that I'm working from, Robbie, if you can just hit, because there's going to be images come up. This ranges, as I've said, quite widely. So the picture on your slide is of Nnamdi Azikiwe, who started the West African Pilot in Nigeria, which became the most widely circulating newspaper in West Africa. On the right, this is the Nigerian Eastern Mail, which was based out of Calabar, produced by the kind of coastal educated elite in that moved around British West Africa. And then if you hit it one more time, Robbie, there is The People, which is a newspaper from Trinidad that was affiliated to the oil field workers and to the largely industrial workers in Trinidad in the 1930s. So it ranges across an ideological spectrum. And one of the points that I want to emphasize and for you to maybe take away is that what I'm about to say to you comes from a fairly wide range of class backgrounds, of ideological standpoints, that could be Marxist, that could be peasant-oriented, that could be liberal-oriented, that could be fighting for the eradication of empire, or could be arguing for the improvement of empire, not necessarily its end. So all of these different perspectives are coming out of the sources that I've analyzed. And from all of this range of perspectives, they are analyzing fascism in relation to colonialism. So this practice of analyzing fascism in relation to colonialism is spanning a wide class and ideological spectrum of opinion. You can flip the slide again, Robbie. So Wallace Johnson was one of the more well-known participants of a history of what I'm referring to and what several scholars refer to as anti-colonial anti-fascism. Now, this history is one where intellectuals and activists and organizers, mainly on the left of the political spectrum, argued that Europe's colonial projects meant they could not combat fascism without simultaneously addressing colonialism. That's the core of anti-colonial anti-fascism. You cannot address fascism without addressing colonialism. While anti-colonial anti-fascism has been recognized as part of the kind of anti-colonial arc of the 20th century, the intellectual genealogy of that arc has, I think, been quite limited. First, and these points are on the slide, histories of anti-colonial anti-fascism tend to focus on the relationship between the Popular Front in Europe and the Communist International, and that kind of thrust of activity as coming in Europe. Now, what I suggest the problem with this is, and what the colonial perspective brings to this, is that the arguments about anti-colonial anti-fascism in Europe tend to see anti-colonial anti-fascism as dying when the Popular Front dies. In other words, by about 1937, this is a quick trajectory, 1935, 36, 37, dead by 1938. And what I want to suggest is that the range of opinions that are reading fascism and colonialism in the colonies changes this timeline, because it doesn't conform to the Popular Front timeline. It lives on into the late 1930s and into the 40s and even later. But that's work that I want to continue to do. So this focus on the Popular Front history and on Europe, I think might shortens the timeline, I would suggest, for readings of anti-colonial anti-fascism. And secondly, my second point is that it tends to read it through two significant events: the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, which is absolutely crucial, I don't deny that, and the Spanish Civil War. And so what I want to suggest here is, again, that these are very these are very important events that are crucial to the debates that happen in the colonies as well, but that Ethiopia and Spain are really only two of the events, and that actually it's events in the colonies themselves that are informing people's interpretation of fascism and colonialism. So before what I ultimately want to argue is that the widespread and public quality of the conversation that we see in the colonies shows that anti-fascism did not derive necessarily from European debates, but directly from the colonial experience and anti-colonial struggle. In other words, anti-fascism in the colonies was not derivative of debates in Europe, but actually using events in the colonies as their focal point for analyzing fascism. Fascism served as a lens for interpreting displays of colonial force, power, and rule, rather than as an accusation made solely for kind of anti-colonial purposes. It's a way of working out what is happening in colonial territory. This revises our intellectual genealogy by confirming that anti-colonialism and the viewpoint of colonized peoples laid the foundations in many respects for anti-fascism. And I'll come back to that in my conclusion, because that claim that I'm making is something that I want to continue to work on and expand. So what I want to do now is give you a flavor of some of the analysis that's going on in the colonies. And I'm going to outline some of the similarities that people identify between colonialism and fascism, and with some of the differences that they identify between colonialism and fascism. Before I do that, for those of you who are less familiar with what's going on in West Africa and the Caribbean in the 1930s, let me just give you a very quick overview of the events that are informing this analysis. So in West Africa in particular, by the mid-1930s, you have a number of different things happening. On the one hand, you have the traditional rulers, and I would put that in quotation marks, traditional rulers, engaging in confrontations and debates with younger generations of people who are educated through the colonial system and are now working as white collar workers, and educated in a British educational system. And so you have generational divides emerging in the 1930s in West Africa. You also have the major event that of this time is what is referred to as the cocoa holdup. It's mainly in the Gold Coast, but also in Nigeria. And this is a widespread alignment between farmers, chiefs, and the educated merchant class who are who engage in boycotts of British goods, who engage in a frustrated critique of British monopoly of the commodities that they are producing, in particular cocoa. So the Gold Coast cocoa holdup is a moment where all of those different class groups are coalescing around a critique of British control of prices for their goods in particular, and the wages for their labor. So wages and prices are kind of coming together in the Gold Coast cocoa holdup. And the cocoa crisis more generally in West Africa. And as I've said, this includes Nigeria. Across the Atlantic in the Caribbean, you have widespread revolts that begin in 1935, I think in St. Kitts, but I could be wrong, and basically pulse throughout all of the islands of the British West Indies between 1935 and they kind of culminate in Jamaica in 1938. But this is very widespread, labor revolts of workers, strikes in particular in all of the islands, but most prominently in Trinidad and Jamaica, Trinidad in 1937, in Jamaica in 1938. And the colonial authorities are trying to figure out how to quell these revolts, how to address some of the demands of workers who are mobilized by Garveyism, who are mobilized by the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, to now stake their claims and criticize colonial authority based upon a wider Pan-African consciousness as well. So all of those things are the backdrop to how people are also analyzing colonialism and fascism. And they come up with these similarities. So Robbie, you can change the slide. So the first similarity that is very clearly coming together in the press is the similarity of the curtailment of civil liberties. So what you get across British West Africa and the Caribbean is bans on books, much of it communist literature, but not necessarily. Garvey's Negro World was at various times banned. Different books are banned. And Negro World is a magazine, monthly. The Negro Worker is the Communist International's version of this, of a monthly paper. So you get censorship of newspapers, you get seditious ordinances that are not only forcing the blocking of freedom of the press, but also freedom of assembly. So the labor revolts themselves in particular led to blocking freedom of assembly. So the governor for example, in Trinidad, blocked at various points public assembly as a way of trying to quell these rebellions. And so people are reading these blocks on freedom assembly, on censorship, as part of the curtailment of civil liberties that occurs under colonialism and under fascism. The second comparison is, I think, quite an astute one. I will admit my bias here. The civil liberties violations, I will add, are an particularly important critique, because what these do is show that civil liberties violations in Britain are addressed as legal cases. They are challenged in the courts, and they are not regular, is the blunt way of putting it. Whereas the critiques of colonialism and fascism in the colonies shows that these civil liberties violations in the colonies are not kind of aberrant cases, but rather the kind of regular technique that is used by colonial authorities to rule over a disfranchised population. So this thickens anti-colonial, anti-fascism towards not just a kind of behavioral critique, but a structural critique. In other words, there's something about the structure of colonialism that makes civil liberties violations a regular part of doing business, doing government business. The deference to the wise leader comes particularly in critiques of how the government is responding to the labor revolts. So Benjamin Muta-Ofai, who I don't have a picture of him, but he was an editor of a Gold Coast newspaper. He knew George Padmore through correspondence at least. And he writes an editorial, which is called Fascism Disguised. And he writes this editorial in 1938. And the fascism that's disguised for Muta-Ofai is what's happening in the British Caribbean. So this is a fairly educated Gold Coast editor of a newspaper who's watching what's happening in the Caribbean and using that to analyze fascism. And in this editorial, he argues that the labor revolts in Trinidad show how the governor tends to rule by decree, holding ultimate authority and the ability to rule as he pleases. Muta-Ofai notes that, quote, the colonial office listen only to the man on the spot. And even in cases which a whole people make an open protest, they are ignored in preference to the wishes of one man. Now, theories of fascism emphasize the superiority of the wise leader who can rule by decree, who can rule arbitrarily, and who is deferred to. And I want to suggest that Muta-Ofai and others, in identifying the rule of the governor and the ability of the rule of the governor to kind of be the authority who can rule by decree, as having a similarity to fascism, is a kind of nuance to our understanding of fascism and colonialism. Further, by connecting commissions of inquiry to practices that undergird fascist authority, Muta-Ofai upended a practice that's central to the colonial state's claim to rule. So what happens in the labor revolts unsurprisingly, is that a commission of inquiry is sent out to multiple commissions of inquiry, first in Trinidad and then in Jamaica, are sent out to try and figure out what's going wrong and how they can solve it. Commissions of inquiry are a regular practice of colonial rule whenever there's a moment of crisis. And Fred Cooper argues that commissions were used to delineate and bind problem spaces in colonies, and a way to kind of set things right. And if colonial commissions of inquiry tend to kind of skirt under the radar of analysis of colonialism, and I think Witoofe in his editorial really brings them to the light in again showing the way that colonial rule can be arbitrary in its forms of governance. So curtailment of civil liberties, superiority of the wise leader, are all kind of classic features of fascism that are being identified and nuanced in colonial territory. And finally, the last example that Robbie has brought up is the use of coercive labor practices and the willingness to use violence to control labor in the colonies. So West African and Caribbean analysis also offered an extended interpretation of fascism by linking Italian conquest in Ethiopia to the Caribbean labor revolts. And the woman pictured on your slide at the bottom, Elma Francois, who was she's working in Trinidad in the 1930s, involved in protests and is arrested at one point in the labor revolts. She is crucial to these analysis of colonialism and fascism in Trinidad, and of linking what's happening in Ethiopia and the violence in Ethiopia by Italy against the Ethiopian population to the violence that's being meted out on workers in the Caribbean in the labor revolts. So what happens in these analyses is that people like Elma Francois, people like Benjamin Witoofe, who I have just mentioned, take the classic Marxist analysis of how fascism aims to resolve economic and social problems by forced kind of violence and anti-labor policies, in particular anti-communist and anti-worker policies. But what they do is say, well, this is extended in colonial territories to excessive violence against workers that are racialized, against workers in the Caribbean who are Black and brown, to put it in today's terms. So they note the kind of excessive bombings that happen in East Africa, the use of chemical warfare, and they look at labor revolts news that is showing how the British authorities apply white militias to kind of quell the labor revolts and are very quick to use violence against workers in instances where they are not using violence against workers in Britain itself. So again, the cross comparisons between what's happening in what is happening in Britain and what's happening in the colonies for colonized peoples is a useful way of trying to understand colonialism and fascism, because what they identify is that practices that don't happen in Britain, but that are fascist-like, are happening in colonial territory. Robbie, you can flip the slide again. So one of the other components to how people are trying to work out fascism and colonialism is to think about the role of racism in fascism. And the answer to this is not a clear and easy one. That's the first thing I want to highlight. Because what people in West Africa and the Caribbean identify is certainly, as I've already said, the willingness to use force, the willingness to use violence upon racialized workers. In the words of one of the people who writes a letter into the newspaper, someone writes that fascists, quote, resolve to persecute, prosecute, and execute those whom they dare to deem as inferiors, in meaning colored humanity. So on the one hand, people recognize that fascism believes in kind of ruling over, persecuting, prosecuting, and executing those who they deem racially inferior. On the other hand, and there's more work coming out on this, fascism, we cannot assume that fascism was anathema to people in colonial territories and to people who experienced racism. And that's the kind of basic assumption. But what the more research people are doing, the more we see that, you know, we cannot assume that that's true, because people can respond to racism in many different ways. And one of the responses to racism is to argue for your own kind of racial unity and racial nationalism. And we see this in West Africa and a little bit in the Caribbean. So one of the newspapers that I analyzed is called Vox Populi in the Gold Coast. Excuse me. This newspaper supported the Alabama Scottsboro Boys, takes a kind of Garveyist alignment, supports the Caribbean workers in the labor revolts, absolutely, supports Ethiopia against Italy, is in conversation with the International African Service Bureau in London. The paper actively argues from a Garveyite position on behalf of local business and Black entrepreneurship. But it also frequently made anti-Semitic attacks against the power of Jewish world finance. It supported the massacre of Haitians in the Dominican Republic as evidence of, quote, strong rule that supports your own country. And it very frequently reprints from Nazi National Socialist newspapers. So it sees in Nazi National Socialism a kind of loyalty to your race and an uplift of the race. Conversely, in the Caribbean, this is an advertisement from Plain Talk, which is a Jamaican peasant-oriented newspaper that exists in the mid 1930s. And this advertisement that's on your screen says, "Stop being fooled, a leopard cannot change its spots. Black aristocracy is worse than fascism. Support Plain Talk." So in this newspaper's argument to support them, they are concerned with arguments that from a kind of Black aristocratic perspective that would argue that what Black people need is to create their own aristocracy, to create their own overrulers. In other words, this newspaper that's oriented towards peasants is recognizing that fascism is not necessarily something that people are going to be against, to put it bluntly. So in other words, the relationship between fascism and racism is very much a contentious question in the debates that you can see in these colonies at the time. And it leads to people kind of culminating around, okay, what if we are forced to choose, what's worse, colonialism or fascism? And Robbie, you can flip to the next slide now. And now I'm going to move towards the differences. So people identify many similarities. And the question is, well, if Germany takes over, for example, if Italy takes over, if Germany invades Britain and we come under German rule, would that be worse? Or ultimately, who are we going to align with? And this question really obviously is going to be coming to a head in 1938, 1939, and into the beginning of the war. And ultimately, what I would suggest from what I've seen is that the conclusion that if forced to choose, Germany would be worse. Fascism would be worse than colonialism. And one of the people that argues this is the man on your slide, Wilfred Domingo, who was a Jamaican, who was also incarcerated as a threat to the war effort when he sailed from Harlem, where he was living in the US, back to his native Jamaica in 1941. He doesn't even get off the ship. They arrest him as a threat to the war effort and incarcerate him for more than a year. But he was also writing in Jamaican newspapers at the time. And one of the things he says is, quote, "The history behind fascism is the dictum that the non-white peoples are inferior and should be kept in a condition of tutelage and subjection politically and socially. This is not a new theory. It was proclaimed by British imperialists decades ago and sung by Kipling. But, and here's the difference, it was never the official policy of government, although it was and is still the practice of French, English, and other imperialists in varying degrees in their colonies." So this is, Domingo's statement is a particularly salient example of what you can see in the debates in the press, which is that ultimately, if forced to choose, British colonialism still offers the potential for a future self-government, a potential for that within the system of colonialism, there is the potential for emancipation eventually. And that the state does not practice racism in the same way as it does under fascism. In other words, institutional capacity for change and reform is still visible. And it's the institutional side of things that they argue is different between fascism and colonialism. In other words, they're seeing they draw similarities between behaviors, between attitudes, between practices, but they draw a slight distinction between the institutional manifestations of colonialism and fascism. Robbie, you can, I think, flip the slide. And so I want to dwell on this fine distinction that's being made. Because what happens is that people identify fascism as something slightly more than colonialism. So this is one quotation from T. Harris. What is fascism? Fascism is the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, and most imperialist elements of finance capital. All of the mosts are my own emphasis. But the idea is that fascism is like much fascist theory, the extension of practices that they are already seeing in their lived reality. And Robbie, you can flip to the next slide. This is epitomized in a poem that is written in The People in Trinidad, and then it's reprinted in Barbados, and then it's reprinted again in the Gold Coast Spectator. So in other words, this conversation that I've just outlined is one in which people are circulating information. This poem moves from Trinidad to Barbados to the Gold Coast, and it emphasizes again that what is fascism? It's more of what we already know. And I want to pause over that slightly more and understand that there's a proximity that's a key component to understanding colonialism and fascism as they exist and function in the world as rationales for violence, exclusion, and authoritarianism. There's a kind of rush to embrace either the similarity. It might be easy to rush to embrace the similarities or the differences between fascism and colonialism, but I think this ultimately just gets us trapped in kind of trying to prove, aha, fascism is colonialism, or aha, colonialism is fascism. And rather, it's that uncomfortable crevice where they are both similar and different that is really how people confronted fascism and colonialism in their daily lives. And actually, I think tells us something about both the nature of fascism and colonialism as not kind of proximate poles that are opposite, but actually ones that are very, very close in proximity to each other. And so I want to suggest that the insights that we can gain from looking at colonized perspectives of fascism and colonialism is to understand the proximity between these two ideologies, if we want to call it. I mean, we can debate whether fascism is an ideology. Most people would say it's too hard to say that's true. But in other words, these are proximate rather than polar opposites. And that ultimately, to understand anti-fascism, we have to understand the anti-colonialism that was at the very heart of anti-fascist movements in the 1930s. And I'm happy to discuss this in the Q&A, but what I want to next move to is the implications of that for the post-war world. Because what I want to suggest and open up is that we cannot understand how anti-colonial movements emerge after 1945, how Black Power emerges in Britain and in the US in the 1960s and 70s, and how they critique fascism very clearly in their ideologies without understanding this earlier history of anti-colonial anti-fascism. So I'll leave it there because I'm now looking at the time and I want to leave some time for discussion. Thank you very much.
15 minutes of question time. I prefer to just kind of hand over to others, really. I'm sure there'll be lots of really good questions for people to ask. I've certainly got a few of my own. So Leslie, can you see the Q&A box if you click on it?
I'm trying to rapidly read.
Yeah, it's quite a lengthy question we have here, but I'll give you a moment to have a quick read through that one, I guess.
Apologies to the person who wrote this question. I'm gonna work from, in short, did fascism simply apply existing models of colonialism?
Just as you're reading through, obviously anyone else, if you've got other questions to add, please do use the Q&A function. I should have pointed out at the start, active chat is disabled for this. That's a York St John policy. So please put any questions through the Q&A tab at the bottom.
I'm trying to, I mean, this is a really good question that the first person is asking, and I'm trying to formulate. Might the connection, because they've rightly identified Césaire's famous words, fascism applied to Europe. Might the connection between fascism and colonialism be reversed? Rather than blood brothers, the Axis imported colonial practices from liberal states into evolving fascist 1930s, 1940s practices. Absolutely, yeah, I certainly see that, and someone else has posted stuff on the work on Nazi expansion. I mean, one of the ways this is visible is in the Nazi and the Italian case for colonies. So certainly in what they are arguing, and even, I mean, Japan is a slightly different case, but all of the fascist those three examples, Germany, Italy, and Japan, are making the case for territorial expansion on the justification that colonies are the natural space of great powers, and that in some respects they are absorbing arguments for colonialism, arguments for liberal imperialism, and working from them in their own territorial expansion. I think that's what the question is getting at, and I would agree with that, that you can see that they're justifying their own territorial expansion using liberal imperial justifications and working from those as well. So that's an interesting flip that has been made.
So it's a really fascinating question, but it might take you some time to absorb everything within that one. But we do have another question that's come in from Dr. Peter White, but actually from York St. John, my boss. So I'll hand over to have a look at that one as well.
Okay, so I'll just read it. Can you say more about connections to the Soviet Union and Black activists who spent time there, i.e. in the 1930s, Soviet foreign policy focused predominantly on Germany, not so much established colonial regimes as was true in the 20s. The Soviet Union itself was increasingly nationalist and colonial in operation long before the late 1930s and run up to the war. Yeah, so many of the Wallace Johnson is an example of a Black activist who goes to Moscow, who is engaged in those debates and doesn't break from the Soviet Union in the way that George Padmore does. Moscow in the late 1920s and 1930s is absolutely instrumental to the debate that I've just outlined. And so while I set up a kind of critique of the historiography that kind of tries to move away from the just a Comintern history, it's absolutely at the root of all of the debates. I'll just give you, and is continuing to influence the debates in colonies. So the circulation of the Communist International's Negro worker newspapers is vital to the conversation that I've just outlined. Marxist thinking is definitely in a lot of the activists, including Elma Francois on the slide. She was involved in an organization in Trinidad who had ties to the International African Service Bureau and to Soviet influenced activists in Britain, Black activists in Britain, like George Padmore for one, and Chris Jones for another. So this is definitely a conversation that's happening between Black British activists who have had various leanings with the Soviet Union and those in the colonies who are connected to them. I will add that one of the things I didn't say or use is that you will see quotes not used as quotes. So Georg Dimitrov's speech about fascism is directly reprinted in more than one Caribbean newspaper, but not as a quotation, just as it's actually just clearly being influenced, clearly an influence on people in their analysis of fascism.
Okay, thank you very much, Leslie. Might be one or two more coming in. I'm just trying to follow as we're going along, but just while maybe one or two more people add a couple of questions. I've got a handful of questions, but I'll try not to ask them all in one go. The first one, I suppose, kind of builds on that point, actually. Obviously, there's lots of fascinating aspects of what you've been talking about, but I thought one thing towards the end, which kind of jumped out at me, was obviously that sort of idea of, the Black nationalist movements and particular individuals, using fascist ideas and trying to emulate some of those ideas as well. I mean, was that something, again, was that very much on the fringe of this? Is that something on the kind of mainstream? And were there actually any direct connections, to fascist parties, fascist governments in Europe that, for obvious reasons, that I can understand if there weren't, but were they sort of literally trying to borrow through connections to those fascist movements, or was it just sort of taking sort of vague ideas and then implementing them within their own sort of particular colonial context, would you say?
The two examples that I gave you are, and the Gold Coast example of that newspaper, are so far some of the only ones I have found. And I think the next step is to dig deeper, because the sources that I've seen imply that there's more to this story that hasn't been unearthed. I haven't seen it unearthed anywhere else. The most that I know is, so, I mean, the broad answer to your question is no. I mean, there's no party, there's no kind of black shirt, gray shirt, long trousered movements in these places. There's very much an awareness of what's happening in South Africa and South African fascist organizations, white South African fascist organizations. One of the reasons for the spark of the Trinidad labor revolts is that oil field workers complain about racism that they're experiencing from white South African managers on the oil fields. So there's direct connections of awareness to what's happening in South Africa. But the closest thing is the Garvey movement. Garvey famously said that he thought that Garveyites were the first fascists. And so there's still a lot more that we need to unearth in that. But he criticized, he supported Haile Selassie, he criticized the invasion of Ethiopia, but he also felt like Selassie had displayed a kind of weakness and that there needed to be a kind of strong kind of nationalist defense of Black people. And he came under that plain talk advertisement, the "Don't be fooled." I think that's a warning from some Garveyites of what they're hearing from Garvey, because Garvey comes under criticism at this time for not fully supporting Haile Selassie and for kind of being drawn to the strong male chauvinism of Mussolini in particular. And so that becomes a kind of critical focal point for people to kind of wrestle with, who are Garveyites. Many of these people are or were Garveyites, who are then wrestling with that aspect of what Garvey starts to say.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating. I think having those sort of connections and running parallel to what the main focus of your study is. I mean, again, another thing that obviously has come out in the presentation, but also in your article, is that sort of centrality of Ethiopia 1935, and it's highly speculative, obviously. I think. Do you think this sort of anti-colonial, anti-fascism sentiment would have been or could have been sort of nipped in the buds? Maybe not the right idea. You can understand, given the long history, etc., why this this parallel would be drawn. But if Britain, France, etc., had demonstrated a bit more backbone and hadn't appeased, do you think that would have had an impact, or do you think it was kind of an inevitability anyway? That just accelerated a process that had already begun with the emergence of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany a few years before this. I mean, again, it's speculative, but do you have a sort of sense?
It actually gets to the heart of why the research I'm doing may or may not be important in telling us what was happening in these places, because my inclination would be no. I mean, I think that colonial rule could have much more easily responded to the crises that they were experiencing if Italy had not invaded and mobilized people on an unprecedented scale to see the kind of misalignment of the world order. I mean, Italy, in one sense, Italy's invasion just proved what everyone knew, and I think that's why it was such an important. It was such a spark moment. Was that it's not like this was something that somehow showed people something they didn't already know. It was that now it was so glaringly obvious on the world stage that the world order was racist, and was that sovereignty was not equal. And without that, that's a great question. Without that, would people still made the comparisons between colonialism and fascism that I've just outlined? I would like to say yes. I mean, all of the crises that I've just focused on don't necessarily have anything to do with Ethiopia, but people were certainly reading everything through Ethiopia. And I don't think they would have. Ethiopia facilitated these more localized analysis of fascism and colonialism.
That's fascinating. It's really interesting. Again, it's not something I'd ever really thought about, the sort of implications of that event in this kind of way. But we have actually run out of time, unfortunately. I had other questions, particularly about your methodology, which is fascinating to me. Again, as someone who doesn't tend to use newspapers, but also someone who has done quite a lot of research in South Africa and Asia and other parts, sort of thinking about the sort of pitfalls and difficulties of that sort of research. But I think we'll probably have to call it a day, unfortunately, Leslie. So again, I'll do the collective round of applause from the attendees as well. Unfortunately, yes, it'd be great to have a sort of live audience, but it is what it is. But a fascinating talk once again, and I've read the article, really interesting, and very much looking forward to reading the bigger project and everything you're working on. Kind of following in the same sort of vein, I think, for the sort of emphasis on newspapers, I know. So, okay, we'll finish up there. And thanks to the attendees for their questions as well. I'm sure if they could, they would thank you for a fascinating talk. Okay, yeah. Let's finish up there then.
Thank you for everyone. And I if you want to speak to me, email me and we can continue the conversation.